Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Chupka. I'm the Vice President for Research and Programs here at the Energy Storage Association. Thank you for attending today's webinar on responsible supply chain policy in the energy storage industry. This webinar is being recorded. Everyone who registered will also receive a link to the recordings and slides within the next couple of days. Questions can be submitted at any time via the questions chat box in your browser, and we'll get to those after our speakers finish the presentations. In the text of your question, please indicate to whom you would like your question addressed. All meetings and teleconferences of the Energy Storage Association are held in accordance with our antitrust guidelines. We ask that you abide by these guidelines during today's webinar. The full guidelines are available in the members area of the ESA website. If you are not yet an ESA member and would like more information, you can reach out to my colleague, Brenda Lovell. Membership includes free access to all of our webinars, including many that are exclusively for members, among numerous other benefits. Please contact Brenda for more information. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about a very big event coming up. Registration is now open for the ESA Annual Conference 2021, which will be held in Phoenix on December 1st through 3rd. Please visit our website for more details, and it'll be great to see everyone again. Today, we are looking into the energy storage supply chain with a focus on environmental, social, and governance policy, sometimes abbreviated as ESG. In addition to making energy storage, particularly battery storage, safer to operate and more sustainable through recycling at the end of its life, the energy storage industry is also assessing responsibility for the impact that its suppliers have on the environment and social welfare. Responsible supply chain policies enhance the sustainability of the energy storage industry, an important attribute in making a rapid and durable transition to a sustainable energy economy. ESA is proud to lead the Energy Storage Corporate Responsibility Initiative to help industry attain ambitious ESG goals and support a sustainable future. I'm delighted to introduce a great panel for today's discussion. First up will be Matthew Murphy, the Chief Operations Officer at Greenbacker Capital. Matt will give an overview of ESG considerations and why supply chain concerns drive action from both clean energy companies as well as investors in those companies. Matt will set the stage for a deeper dive into some of the mechanics of responsible supply chain strategies. Paul Wormser will be next. He is the Vice President for Technology at Clean Energy Associates. Paul will explain how his firm helps other firms gain visibility into their supply chains, for example, by tracing the provenance of mineral inputs into production. Our final presenter is Paul Charles, President and CEO of American Battery Factory Incorporated. Paul will describe a different approach to responsible supply chain management, namely developing domestic supply chains that bring upstream environmental and labor issues into the U.S. legal framework. After their remarks, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. You can ask questions via the questions chat box at any time, and we'll read those out for the presenters when we get back to the Q&A session at the end. Now I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you everybody for having me today. Just quick background on Greenbacker so people can understand my perspective. We are a owner and operator of renewable energy assets, solar, wind, battery storage, as well as some small ancillary investments. We raise money through wealth managers, so all of the money in our fund is mom and pop money raised through wealth managers, registered investment advisors, brokers, broker dealers. We are today about $1.6 billion total equity investment, 32 states, and about 300 assets. Next slide. So with all the discussion in the media and in the public about supply chain, I think it's important to understand this concept that our investment, renewable energy, and people seeking to invest in renewable energy, it is in first place to make money, right? Because that is why you invest primarily to make money. But beyond that, the reason that we continue to see new investment in this space is because it is renewable energy, energy storage, solar, wind is seen as an ESG product. And it should be, and it needs to continue to be. And so when things come up like our inability to understand our supply chain, ethical sourcing, those are threats towards our industry not being considered an ESG product, and we need to account for them as such. Next slide. Just a couple of data points here, and I think it's pretty interesting. If you look at the Hargreaves and Lansdowne data on the bottom left, that question of environmental and governance considerations and how they play into people investing their money, that question didn't exist 10 years ago. So it's amazing because it's a pretty large part of what people consider according to this data, and there's similar data all over the public domain about how important environmental governance considerations are becoming. When you think the fact that it didn't really exist 10 years ago, that no one was asking these questions, that it was on no one's radar, it paints an even different picture of investors really in a revolutionary way changing how they view the ESG portions of their investments. And then if you look at this for the younger generation and for millennials who are just now, starting to become investors that are deploying large capital into spaces, they're even more interested in ESG matters and making sure that their investments are sound and holistic. Next slide. So one of the most important parts about understanding our supply chain and advancing where we are with understanding our supply chain is, for me, in dealing with investors, really balancing expectations versus reality. Investors, as I said, they want to make money. That is paramount. And then second is how they feel about their investment. It's not far behind, but it would be silly for us all to think that people are investing money, not interested in making money. Expectations come from the market, and then ultimately my actions as an owner of these assets are a reaction to that market. And the market reacts very much to what is happening in the media. What would happen with Texas in the winter. I spent 4 months answering questions about what was going on in Texas, despite the fact I don't own any assets in Texas, because I avoided that for some foresight into seeing what was going to happen. So we need to be careful about how we explain things to the market. I think this is of paramount importance. We just have to continue. This is understanding our supply chain, being better with our supply chain, making real and tangible impact in our supply chain. It's not flipping a switch. It's probably going to affect returns, at least in the short term, and probably in the long term. And there aren't a lot of options right now. That is all counterintuitive to the expectation set when investors ask us these questions. How quick can you change? What are your options? Frankly, there aren't that many. And what we need to do to new money into this space, into existing money in this space as an owner, but also as the service providers, the manufacturers, everyone that works to support the owners, is we need to be very clear. It's a long-term problem. There is a balance of return on investment and the impact that we can make. And it's a major change. It's not small tweaks to the industry. Solar and wind industry, the battery storage industry, we have not understood our supply chain enough in the past. We are young industries, to be expected. And this is going to be a really long process of evolving our industry. And I don't want new money coming into the space thinking we've got it all figured out. Next slide. And I think this sums it up, is we can continue to bring money into the space. We need to continue to accelerate the adoption of renewable energy. That is our #1 goal. That will continue to happen if investors into this space know that they can trust the brand of renewable energy, of energy storage, and know that we have a plan to improve. What money coming into this space investors don't need is they don't need us to change overnight. They need us to be transparent. They need us to track and demonstrate results. and that will lead to the healthy growth of the industry. So I think as a whole, people get up in arms. We have to make all changes now. It has to be immediate. Everyone's making pledges. Everyone's trying to say we can change things radically and in a revolutionary way. And I think that the approach needs to be much more measured, right? We need to stay to the mission. The mission is to accelerate the adoption of renewable energy. This can be changed, and it needs to be changed methodically and responsibly, step by step. Thank you for your time, and I'll now pass it to Paul Wormser of CEA.
Matthew, thank you. I think you've set the stage really well, and in terms of the expectations elements that you had there, where the expectation is returns won't be impacted, I would say that they can actually be impacted favorably with responsible supply chains. And I completely agree with the premise that this is not as easy as flipping a switch, and it needs intention and time to work. So I'll talk to some of those issues during the next few minutes. Everybody, thank you for your attention today. And Mark and ESA, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this very important topic today. Just quickly, CEA, Clean Energy Associates, is a technical advisory firm. Our business purpose goes as this. We believe that by helping our clients and stakeholders deploy solar and storage solutions worldwide, we are creating a better future, and that's what motivates us. So I want to talk about where we came from and how we got to where we are today. Back in 1930, the US established a law against the importation of any item, any goods made with forced labor or child labor. And that law has continued on the books. Just last July 2020, the State Department and other agencies of the government came out with a very specific advisory that said, beware of sourcing anything from a particular province in China. The province is known as Xinjiang. This is a province on the western side of the country where there is believed to be a condition of what I consider to be described as rampant forced labor, and therefore anything that is made in that province has now got the expectation or the allegation that it is made with some element of forced labor. So that started up in 1930, the advisory in July of 2020. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble finding the button there. Lexi, if you can help me go back while I find the invisible button, that would be really good. Perfect, right there, thank you. So this is where the province of Xinjiang is in China. It's the western part of the country. It has enormous natural resources. It also has an abundance of very low cost electricity supply, principally driven by very abundant, very available coal at a low cost. And as a result, this province has become home for a number of energy intensive industries, but notably in the area of raw materials and raw materials processing that require a lot of energy. Xinjiang has really become one of the centers of gravity that affects a number of industries. It certainly affects the solar industry, and I have the premise that it affects the storage industry as well. The idea, of course, of forced labor is something nobody has any tolerance for. We talk with suppliers, we talk with utility companies, we talk with developers, we talk with owners all over the place. Everybody is against forced labor. Everybody has zero tolerance for forced labor. And yet we all look at this through the lens of the West, of the United States and Western countries. China believes there is no forced labor in China. And so we want to recognize that the lens through which we evaluate the presence of forced labor may be different from one place to another. If anything is suspected of coming into the United States with any constituent of forced labor, then Customs and Border Protection has the obligation to prevent those goods from coming into the United States. They do this by issuing what's called a withhold release order, and they will detain a container or a group of containers coming in if they have reason to believe that there is something in there that was made with forced labor. It doesn't mean that the end product was made with forced labor. It could even be the raw materials that were used that were somehow extracted or processed with some element of forced labor. Once they detain a shipment, the importer has an opportunity to demonstrate and to prove that in fact there is no forced labor, but this is an extraordinarily difficult thing to prove. And as a consequence, just as you heard Matt a few moments ago talk about transparency in the supply chain, I also want to talk about transparency in the supply chain insofar as if you as an importer can demonstrate where everything came from, what we sometimes refer to as provenance or chain of custody, then you can demonstrate to Customs and Border Protection, most likely, that all of the things in your product came from companies that were not identified as having forced labor, or from regions, or from industries. And that's one way to deal with this. Transparency alone is not enough. If you're going to deal with customs and getting out of a detention situation, you'll want to not only have your supply chain map, you'll not only want to be able to show where things come from, but you'll want to have a social compliance system for each of the different links in your supply chain. You and I might think of that as a code of conduct, and that code of conduct would almost certainly say something like, we have zero tolerance for forced labor and we hold our suppliers to the same standard. There are also benefits to having a transparent supply chain that I'll talk about in a few minutes. In 2021, just a couple of months ago, an updated advisory came out that was much more extensive than the 2020 advisory. And this advisory again points towards forced labor allegations in that same province in China, but it goes on to describe a lot more of the materials that could be produced with forced labor. And some of those materials are relevant to manufacturing batteries and energy storage systems. So this is a good signal that it is very possible, I would say even probable, that Customs and Border Protection will take additional action against additional suppliers or perhaps additional regions around Xinjiang or around Greater China to put the spotlight on goods coming in. So I think there's a good opportunity for us to learn from solar, because solar is going through this process before storage, but storage is coming. And on the solar side, the same issues arose. And in the legislation in the House and in the Senate, there's a raw material used in solar manufacturing called polysilicon that was highlighted as coming from this particular region, where almost half of the polysilicon raw material of the world comes from this region. And as a result, the Solar Energy Industries Association launched the development of what's called a traceability protocol. And this is a framework for suppliers to follow that helps bring to bear a robust and transparent supply chain from the end product all the way back to the beginning. And while this was developed for solar and specifically applied to the solar module, there are many elements of this framework that could equally apply to storage and storage systems. That came out in April. That was followed by an action by Customs. They did in fact issue a withhold release order that was specific to the solar industry and more industries. And this WRO was issued identifying one particular company in China named Hoshine, and any product that they make that is silica based, which includes the raw material that's used in solar. And it identified these as having the presumption of having been made with forced labor. In other words, with the WRO in place, Customs has the position that, in my language, not their language, but in my language, if you are using Hoshine material that is silica-based, you are guilty until proven innocent. So you certainly have a chance to prove your innocence, but again, that's very difficult. So a transparent supply chain, one that talks about where your materials are coming from, as long as it indicates that none of those materials are these materials in the subject of the WRO, then Customs would ostensibly release any shipment that they've detained. The industry was challenged in solar, and there's a lesson here for the energy storage industry to be prepared. The solar industry had prepared for a focus on this material called polysilicon, and traceability programs were being put in place, but the actual WRO went upstream. It went upstream to the precursor, which is called metallurgical grade silicon, and the solar industry was not prepared. And that has caused some significant and very immediate disruption in solar supply. So those of you who are in the energy storage space, you want to consider the possibility of WRO actions that would affect storage. And those actions could go quite a bit upstream. In fact, if you go to the original 1930 law, the 1930 law explicitly defines the mining operation as subject to the same issues. If you do get detained by Customs, there are certain actions you can take, and Customs really focuses on having supply chain due diligence done by you if you're a buyer, and if you're a seller, to be prepared with these kinds of things. And this refers to making sure your supply chains are ethical and your supply chains are audited. So the ethics of the supply chain can deal with those codes of conduct that I mentioned before, or what Customs refers to as a social compliance system. And supply chain audits would be, once you have the supplier's system in place and their supply chain map in place, an independent third-party review is appropriate. Customs also gives us the benefit of what they call an FAQ page, or a frequently asked questions page. And here's an example of the frequently asked questions page that they published for cotton, which is also currently under a WRO. All cotton goods that have provenance to Xinjiang are under the WRO. And you can see here that what Customs is looking for is quite a bit of documentation, quite a bit of records that show all of the elements in the supply chain and all of the transactional documents between those elements to make sure that the supply chain does not have transactions that would be considered by Customs to be illegal. The alternative, again, is to prove there's no forced labor in any of the nodes, but that is a very difficult standard. So if you can prove that you avoid the subject of the WRO altogether, it's a low-risk approach and a practical approach. Here's a super simple view of what a supply chain might look like. And we often start this by looking at the right side. There are markets that are served by products. Those products might be products A, B, C, and D from different places. Those might be assembled from things that come through process C1, C2, C3 from different places. Those might be made from processes B1, 2, and 3, all the way back to raw materials. And if those raw materials, in this particular case, are sourced from Xinjiang, it could limit where those raw material supply chains can go, what parts of the world market they can serve. And in some cases, you'll notice that raw materials, in this case, again, in the simple view, that have provenance to Xinjiang, end up going into processes where a factory may have raw materials from Xinjiang or raw materials from other places. And those factories need to make sure they segregate those two product lines, and they have a robust way of making sure there's no, what I call, contamination of the product coming to you from the raw material made in Xinjiang. This is a little bit more complicated, because, as before, the government of China believes firmly that there is no forced labor in China. Indeed, they take that a step farther, and they've now established a law in China called the Anti-Sanctions Law, which prohibits anybody's behavior or any company's behavior that would indicate that the company or the individual is following US policy in contrast to Chinese law. What this means is open discussions about forced labor, open discussions about boycotting certain regions of China. Those are very hard to have these days in China. But I think what we can do is we can talk about traceability. We can talk about chain of custody. We can talk about transparency without getting in trouble or without putting our Chinese suppliers and colleagues in a difficult situation. But this does make transparency more difficult. It does make cooperation with all the members of the supply chain more difficult. So when it comes to storage, storage is just as complicated as solar, if not more so. We already have a withhold release order that's related to the DRC, a major source of some of the elements that go into energy storage. And when it comes to traceability for things like cobalt, cobalt traceability is difficult. And we sometimes source cobalt from large mining operations, but they source cobalt from small artisanal mines. And those are the ones that are perhaps the most difficult to get traceability on. And that means that going from finished battery all the way back to the mine where the raw material was extracted can be really difficult. And again, going back to Matt's point before, this is not instantaneous, and it can be very challenging to get here. When you look at lithium and nickel, while we don't see reports right now of forced labor in mining or in processing, we certainly see reports about environmental consequences. And so when we take a look at traceability and we look at some of the benefits of traceability, we can figure out where the lithium comes from, where the nickel comes from. We can do an environmental stewardship program and analysis to help understand if there's a lithium producer or a nickel producer that's better than another because of environmental stewardship. We would be able to know that if we have full transparency on where these come from. And in terms of how easy or how difficult this is, the green columns indicate where it's somewhat easier to do traceability. The red columns indicate where it's somewhat more difficult to do traceability. So it's relatively easy if you're the battery manufacturer to know where the anodes and cathodes and those materials are coming from. But again, going upstream becomes more difficult. So if we're going to have a full traceable, full transparency supply chain, the time to really start working on this is now. It's also interesting to see how much material goes through China when it comes to storage and when it comes to lithium-ion batteries. And what you see here is most of the mining operations are not in China, but most of the refining operations are. So you want to have supply chain transparency to the cell production, to the anode and cathode production, to the refining operation, much of which is occurring inside of China, some of which may be occurring in Xinjiang. And you want to also take a look at what mining operations are happening around the world and how those relate to sustainability, stewardship, and labor issues for supply chain. So is it worth doing all this? I would say absolutely, it's worth it. You certainly don't want to have a shipment that you're waiting for get stuck at customs, nor does the supplier who's bringing it in. You probably have a code of conduct that says you tolerate no forced labor, and you want to make sure that that code of conduct is followed. Your buyers and your customers are going to be concerned about labor issues. They have preferences. Those preferences are increasingly targeted at those ESG issues that Matt mentioned before. You know, I don't want a large carbon footprint. I don't want forced labor. I do want environmental stewardship. So these are some of the benefits. It also allows you to do a root cause analysis, which is very useful if something goes wrong. So these transparency and traceability issues are very important on a number of fronts. So in terms of overall takeaways, it's a good time right now that if you're not focused on a full supply chain identification and transparency, it's time to start. If you're not collecting the codes of conduct from all the links in those supply chain, it's a good time to start. if you're not contracting for supply in such a way that it addresses this and enables things like collection of supply chain maps, codes of conduct, traceability, and audits, it's a good time to start. It's not easy. So there are certainly issues in the way, including, as I mentioned before, with respect to China, the overall anti-sanctions law. But be prepared for the fact that withhold release orders that affect the storage industry could very well come out of the advisory, or even further from existing WROs that focus on forced labor issues related to China, related to Xinjiang. And this is a really good time to really focus on supply chain transparency for all of the benefits that it can bring to you as a buyer or a supplier. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Paul Charles, the other Paul, for today.
Thank you very much, Paul. Wonderful data points, and Matt, appreciate your comments on that as well too. It's we're gonna kind of transition now and have a conversation relative to actually building cells in America. And I'm also looking for the invisible ability to move to the next slide. So Lexi, if you could perhaps move it to the next slide, I would appreciate that. Great, thank you so much, appreciate that. American Battery Factory is quite unique. We're actually setting up the first network of safe, non-toxic lithium iron phosphate battery cell factories in the United States. We're going to start in the US and then we'll expand internationally. And we're focusing in 3 areas that frankly get little to no press, and those are primarily US military and government needs, obviously stationary storage, and then the low-speed electric vehicle markets. ABF's approach on setting up factories is really one of a decentralized approach. Rather than having these massive, these monolithic cell factories that can be 100 gigawatts or even larger or so, they can be very positive, but they also can have a negative effect upon a local community. So our approach is to have smaller, better chosen locations that'll have a positive impact upon the local community, starting at 3 gigawatts going to 15 gigawatts. Also, we've been able to choose a chemistry that uses less metals, no cobalt and no nickel. In addition to our primary production lines, we also are adding pilot, or what we call foundry lines. And what the opportunity there is it allows us to bridge academia and private innovation with the battery industry. And we do that by creating these conduits from laboratory benchtop scale technologies and innovations all the way through to mass production. And that's really missing in the industry within the United States currently. We also will be locating our R&D center located within the factory. We're big proponents of that. There's just something that happens when you got a PhD that sits down at the cafeteria table with an operator. Different points of life, different points of view, but synergies that come out of that really can be remarkable. And as we've talked about here with the previous presentations here, the supply chain has really been Chinese-centric, but we're transitioning that over to a North American and specifically a US-based vertically integrated supply chain. And all that's guided by ESG principles. Another unique aspect of ABF is that typically the normal factory that goes up that produces batteries and cells, they're custom, they're one-off. We're creating a template approach using rapid construction design and philosophies on this. This will allow us to stand up our factories in 18 to 24 months. By the way, the entire ownership of American Battery Factory is 100% US citizens. This is not a joint venture environment. And great, thank you for getting that to work, Lexi. In terms of the challenges that American Battery Factories face in developing an ESG founded battery cell supply chain, it's really one word. It's what Paul has talked about extensively. It's China. China really does control the processing aspect of these raw materials. And the number on the right-hand side here, as you can see, is 80% of all raw materials that go into lithium cells come out of China. We're not saying that's where they originated, but that's where the processing occurs on that. And China has done a phenomenal job of vertically integrating the supply chain truly over decades. I've personally witnessed the acquisition of in-ground assets in Mexico, as well as all over the world. They've done a phenomenal job of that. oops, sorry about that. Okay, let me go back one slide. There we go. As Paul had mentioned, 75% of the total capacity in terms of production for lithium cells currently comes out of Asia, specifically China. And there's about 124 gigafactories currently. Now let's take a look at the bottom of the chart here. And over this next decade, things are going to transition a bit. So from 77% in China, it's going to drop down to 57% globally. And frankly, the reason for that is because Europe is really stepping up. They're going from 13% global production of cells to a third. Pretty remarkable. The US is staying flat at 10%, albeit we are adding about a dozen new factories. So we'll have a little over 20, 21, 22 factories within the US. Keep in mind that these 226 factories by the end of this decade are primarily focused on one thing, and that's electric vehicle market. And so the areas that we address really are not being dealt with very well. American battery factory is really guided by ESG founding principles. And what we've found is it makes daily decision-making, the daily decision-making process much, much easier. Some of our principles are as we avoid or minimize engagement with foreign governments and entities that have histories of human rights abuses. We also do not engage in unethical or unsustainable manufacturing and sourcing practices for materials. And we also heavily focus on engaging in the training and development of our workforce with a commitment to non-discrimination in hiring and advancement of talent. In terms of the supply chain, it can be broken up into three categories. One is the upstream supply chain, which basically it's the in-ground assets. Next is the midstream, and that's really where we play in manufacturing the individual cells. We create those cells and then we provide those to pack manufacturers or integrators. And what they do is they take our cells, they weld them together, they add what's called a battery management system, or frankly, it's just a little computer system, wrap some plastics around it, and then you can buy it at Costco or whatever the end market is on that. But it's very important to understand the differences associated with each steps of the supply chain. We're taking steps to vertically integrate the supply chain into North America, specifically the US, as we transition from China to the US. That'll also help to reduce our global greenhouse gas footprints because we don't have to be dealing with shipping and transition from literally the other side of the world. We have a three-step process associated with this goal. The first is we're sourcing processed raw materials here in the US. We also work with recycling capabilities, once again, all domestically. Step two is to license or acquire sustainable processing technologies. And step three is to eventually be able to acquire, create, or actually joint venture with these in-ground assets as well as the recycling technologies associated with this. Everybody always asks about lithium. Are we going to run out? Do we really have enough? Well, over the next 3.5 years, all the data that we've been able to see says that the global volume will be about 3 times that we currently have. And as Paul mentioned earlier, most of the volume really comes out of South America as well as Australia that then gets shipped over into China. Now, things are changing in these countries where they're doing processing in their countries. But what hasn't changed for the most part is the process. The process truly goes back millennia. It's a leaching process, just using the sun literally to evaporate it in massive ponds that look beautiful, but frankly, they're not good for the environment. And then the other process is smelting. And once again, that goes back to the dawn of human existence on that. In America, we're taking a far different approach to this. We're known for and really have this ability for innovation. And in terms of processing for lithium, that's where we're putting our efforts into that particular area. There's a closed loop environmentally friendly system that's been currently being used and scaled out of Southern California. And that allows lithium to be processed in literally hours and not in months. There's also filtration technology that reduces processing time by 90%. America has actually been pretty amazing in developing these technologies. Now, in terms of sourcing lithium, we plan to purchase our lithium right here in the US. And one of the largest, actually is the second largest supply that's been identified in the world is literally in Nevada. And fortunately, the US government has approved that mine for extraction as well as processing. And they're going to be using a carbon neutral open pit approach with on-site processing right there. And the fact that they're a US entity that's a very good situation for all of us, because that means that they're governed by laws which have a very positive perspective in terms of labor as well as the environment is concerned. Now, when people talk about lithium, they typically take all these chemistries and lump them into one bucket. I'm going to make it pretty simple here. The three chemistries on the right-hand side have cobalt. The chemistry on the left-hand side, LFP, does not have cobalt. Cobalt is a wonderful material in that it has incredible energy density. So if you need to propel a car 0 to 60 in 2 or 3 seconds, cobalt is a very valuable asset to have on your side there. But there's also challenges associated with that from a safety perspective, from a longevity perspective, and the like. That's why we have chosen to go with lithium iron phosphate, at least for the markets that we've chosen. Once again, are military, as well as stationary storage, and then slow-moving electric vehicles. Some of the key attributes of LFP, lithium iron phosphate, is that you're not going to be having these fire issues. We read in the media frequently here about these car fires and stationary storage energy facilities around the world that catch fire. They're not with LFP technologies. Okay, so safety is a big issue. You're going to see a huge transition from the EV market, frankly, on over. So we don't have any of these $2 billion debacles. As I said, we do not use cobalt. And not a lot of folks understand, but Paul briefly had mentioned that there's over 400,000 modern child slaves that are involved in the process of mining cobalt. It's a nasty material in order to extract as well as to process. We also do not use nickel, so frankly, using fewer metals allows our carbon footprint to be greatly reduced. The lifespan of using LFP is also 2 to 4 times longer than cobalt-based lithium, and if you compare that to acid, it literally can be 10 times longer. LFP is non-toxic, maintenance-free. Bottom line, it's a very good chemistry for specific applications. And once again, we encourage people to choose the right chemistry and be intentional in that aspect and be appropriate. Another aspect here that not a lot of people talk about are the actual buildings that we use in order to run our businesses, in order to set up our manufacturing. And here at American Battery Factory, we've chosen to use the most eco-friendly building solution on the market today. And it's a tension membrane technology. And yes, it kind of looks like a tent, but it's far beyond that. Tesla's actually started to use this, and they stood up a 137,000 square foot factory in 19 days. This technology is literally made in North America. They actually fabricate it here in Utah. 3 to 6 week lead time on this. And it's seismic rated, Cat 580 mile an hour winds. It's a third to half the price of traditional construction, LEED certified. And what I really like is when you get done with the construction site, there's nothing that goes into the waste sites, into landfill. It's a very small CO2 footprint. American Battery Factory, as I said, we're creating this North American cell ecosystem that's governed by ESG principles. And we're partnering with a few different types of entities. First and foremost, suppliers of materials and components. So we're putting our hand up saying, we are a buyer, we are a customer. And that's the key thing that's really held back the supply chain within North America. There just haven't been customers. Second is battery cell integrators, those people that purchase our cells and then make final products that people can actually use. Battery technology innovators, energy solution providers that are targeting the U.S. military, government, battery storage, low-speed EVs, and frankly, people that just want to buy something that's made in the U.S. We also have a desire and have continued expanding our relationships with energy firms that truly are ESG and renewable energy focused. So to kind of net everything out here, we found that it's the easiest to really have ESG principles. If you have those principles, then that directs and guides your daily decisions in a much easier format as opposed to looking at everything in an individual basis. And I encourage you to extol your ESG vision company-wide so everybody understands and knows what your company stands for. And be bold, be proactive, and get involved, particularly with federal representatives. I'd love to talk with folks offline on what we've been able to do in working with Congressman Curtis and being involved with providing amendments for the infrastructure bill. But also be a pragmatist. As Paul has mentioned, as well as Matt, it's going to take time to transition these supply chains over. But we do have power. if we require certain types of attributes in terms of our suppliers, they will stand up to that. And finally, let's create specific action items to support your vision of an ESG founded supply chain. Truly believe that it can occur. I'd like to turn the time on over to Mark now for a Q&A session.
Thanks so much, Paul. And many of you have already submitted questions, and you can continue to ask questions during the Q&A session as well by using the question chat box in your browser. This is a question that loops back to Matt. So Paul Wormser indicated that there can be situations where adherence to ESG principles can enhance profits, but certainly there are cases where there are trade-offs. How much of a trade-off are investors willing to undertake? Is it, for example, would it be acceptable to many investors in the ESG space to go from a 15% return to a 14% return, or would they be content with a 15% to a 10% return? What's your view of the trade-off involved?
That's a fantastic question, and I think the answer is we don't know yet. So we, at least in the way that our fund is structured, right, we provide a return to our investors that's pretty standard through a dividend. And when we have considerations we need to make around price, like this isn't the first thing that would increase or decrease the price of our investments, we generally handle those through our own means. We have never gone to the market and said, hey, we could be better, more sustainable, better for the world, but it will come at a cost. That's just not a question that's been addressed. Frankly, in this space, we've all been incredibly excited to take in more money to accelerate the adoption of renewable energy. And so we have just not gotten there yet. And it's going to be a brave new world where those decisions and those conversations with investors might need to happen.
All right, well, thank you.
Mark, this is Paul Charles. I actually had a quick comment on that, if you don't mind, from a manufacturing perspective on this. There's a great misnomer, I think, from a global perspective, in that China has the cheapest of everything, and that's simply not true. The cost for energy, for instance, in China has gone up dramatically. It's actually more expensive for energy in China than many places here in the U.S. Similar situations on the labor environment, where it used to be $1,000 a year, it's $1,000 a month now. And in terms of the land can often be more expensive in China than it is here in the U.S. And so what we have found is that, as once again, we're transitioning the supply chain, but we're very, very cost competitive in some situations, and some components are actually cheaper here in the U.S. And when you add in, the whole supply chain ecosystem of transportation uncertainty and other costs and tariffs associated with this, the U.S. can be very, very competitive if indeed we are smart and if we use automation.
All right, thanks. Very, very helpful addition. Here's a question that actually just came in, and I'm going to go ahead and skip over to this because I think it's really seminal to the theme of this webinar. And the question is, and I'll address this to any or all of the panelists: how can a large buyer of renewables and batteries, say a utility or energy retailer, drive change in the supply chain? What would be the specific asks or tactics?
Let me tackle that for a starting point. A single large buyer probably can't move the industry, but an association of buyers probably can. And we have the benefit of ESA right here with us today, and soon ESA as a member of ACP, and we have SEIA looking at this at the association level. We also have, I think, the same kind of thing happening over in Europe, where you can think of these associations as aggregation bodies to help get everybody more or less on the same page on the demand side. And with that, you can impact the supply side. We see this happening now in solar. I can imagine that we're going to see this happen in storage. We also have the benefit, if you wish, or the weapon and the tool of the regulatory environment, which is creating gates that suppliers have to go through. And these can also help drive change. Furthermore, we see the financial institutions deciding where they're going to put their money. And as we heard from Matt at the very beginning, there's an ever increasing amount of money going into ESG related products and services. And I think, you go where the money is. And if the money is going in that direction, it's going to help pull the supply chains into transparency, traceability, and environmental stewardship.
All right, thank you. Anybody else want to take a crack at that?
I would add just that the industry generally, and I'm drawing parallels to solar here, right? Because energy storage, I am assuming will adopt some of the same financial structures as solar as it matures as an industry in the United States. But ultimately, the party that has the most influence is the financing parties. If energy storage gets attached to the ITC, it's tax equity players. Otherwise, it's just debt players. But they really have the biggest influence. If they put their foot down and say we're not lending money to people that they don't have a sustainable supply chain, it changes everything overnight. And so I think that is really the central place where the industry can move and be affected is, when you get your big financial institutions that are pouring debt into this industry to make those sort of commitments.
This is Paul Charles. I have a few comments on this. First and foremost, this is a national security issue. We really need to understand that if we're going to have success in standing up manufacturing here in the U.S., that it needs to come from multiple different places. But first and foremost, literally from a government perspective, where U.S. manufacturing of the whole supply chain should be given preferential treatment associated with this. And I do agree with Matt and Paul's comments in terms of having the right financial structures associated with this. But furthermore, even on the building side, to be able to have continuity and differentiations between different types of chemistries and what is, what chemistry is the best for whatever the particular application is. But I do agree that even having one group or one association step up and being bold and saying, no, we want to have U.S. manufacturing, we want to have control of our supply chain, we want to create an ecosystem that'll be unparalleled on a global basis. And frankly, we're having conversations with utilities that envision that and see that and actually want to support that. So it is happening. I just wish it would go faster.
All right, thanks. Very good. There's a kind of a related question that I want to throw out at this point. Would ESG throughout supply chain improve resilience of an enterprise enough to translate reduced risk of disruption into investor value? I'd like to maybe throw that to Paul Charles first, and then the rest of the panel.
Absolutely. Right now, if you see what studies have come out, Bank of America released a study 2 months ago that says in 3.5 years from now, the global supply for batteries for the EV market will be done. Literally, the capacity will be filled. The demand will be beyond the capacity with this. And so, from our perspective, the ability to know and secure your supply chain, to know you'll have product available in the US, in North America, is of great value. If you're selling a service or a product and you have the ability to literally take your customer to the manufacturing facility here in the US and say, here, you can literally watch your product be made, as opposed to, well, we think it's in process overseas, and when it eventually gets on a boat, a couple months here, a couple months waiting offshore, we're not exactly sure when it's going to be here. And then when you talk about all the sourcing issues on the raw material supplies, is it going to be held? Is there going to be conflict materials associated with this or so? I think it really simplifies the investment perspective, and it enhances our supply chain capabilities if the manufacturing and the supply chain go hand in hand and are literally here in North America. But this is a supply and demand issue. It's very simple. The bottom line is, if we commit to buy North American a product, the supply chain will follow. The technology's here. What hasn't happened is that the scaling hasn't happened. And so we've seen literally 24 suppliers into our supply chain that says, we'll step up if we know we have a customer.
I'd like to add to that. So the question somewhat answers itself. If it's resilient, it's likely to reduce risk. But we've seen in the last nearly 2 years a real opportunity to acknowledge, recognize, and deal with resiliency in the supply chain. We've had cases where factories have been shut down because of COVID, and then there was a shortage, and the shortage caused a price increase or a delay of shipments. We've seen logistics costs from Southeast Asia to the US go up by a factor of 5 in some cases, even more. We've now seen new regulatory issues. We now see also big changes in tariff issues. So to me, resiliency means don't depend on one supplier, don't depend on one country, but make sure that you have a supply chain that has the flexibility and adaptability that if a crisis happens in one location, you can be agile and move your supply chains in a different way so that you're not impacted in a negative way. It's not always easy to do this instantly. It's not always easy to do this without incurring some change in cost structure, but I would suggest that understanding the supply chain risks at every node that affect throughput, that affect logistics, that affect regulatory issues and tariff issues, and making sure you have a ready plan B and a ready plan C, that's a very appropriate way to go.
Okay, thank you. I think this question is for Paul Wormser. And it has to do with the withholding release order. Why is there such a high burden of proof to eliminate WRO in terms of the presumption that you have to overcome that there might be materials in question in an order? And what was the intent back in the 1930s? And how does it work now? Why is it so hard to prove that there isn't forced labor in the materials?
Well, first, customs doesn't detain shipments arbitrarily. Customs has to have some reason to believe that the shipment contains something that was made with forced labor before they'll detain it. And if you're detained, and if you can prove there's no forced labor, customs is happy. On the other hand, as you just questioned, proving the absence of forced labor is very difficult. And in the very surgical issue of what's happening with Xinjiang, China, the international agencies that are known for doing assessments of labor are not able to operate in Xinjiang today. Either they can't operate freely, or because they have risk to their people, because they don't believe they're going to get an objective interview process without oversight and control by the authorities. Many of these agencies have just decided they're not doing labor audits in that region today. In other words, you can't prove whether the labor is forced or not forced because you can't audit. And that makes things more difficult. You may get invited to do an audit, but we see right now that actually executing a robust, comprehensive labor audit is just not plausible. So today, we all go back to the 1930 law, but forced labor has become a hot topic. In the storage industry, I believe it's coming more and more. In the solar industry, it is absolutely front and center. It's front and center in the cotton industry. The tomato industry is less so, but it's there. And so dealing with this, again, following the recommendations and the strategy presented by the association, the Solar Energy Industry Association, since you can't prove the absence of forced labor, at least you can prove that nothing in your product came from a particular company or from a particular region.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid we've arrived at the end of the hour, and I'd like to thank the presenters for a very informative and interesting session. Don't forget to check out the ESA Annual Conference on December 1st through the 3rd in Phoenix. We'll see you there. Please stay safe and healthy and have a great rest of the day. Thanks for attending.
Thanks to all.